Maybe I can start by complaining to Ottmar Edenhofer, because in a way he told you my little secret. Normally, as a moderator, you should not take sides, or at least you should hide that you have taken sides already. He told you I did so, and I'm more landing to that side than to Ottmar Edenhofer. The reason why I did this is actually maybe because I just didn't get his equations. Before I did the research to my book, I had a long talk with him. Maybe I just didn't get him right. But I know that a year after, he was very furious when he saw my book, and in a way he complained, "You didn't really get me." The result of that was that we're sitting here, we're debating those issues, and I think that this debate is one of the most important that economists can have these days. And the longer I think about it, the longer I deal with those issues, I write about those issues, the more interesting I find them. And I find them especially interesting among people that care for environment, that care for climate, that care for the common good, and not just the traditional economists. So having those two next to each other will make it easy for me. It will make it very fruitful for you to really get what the point is. And let me just very, very briefly mention what's the common ground of the two. I think both of them actually argue that commons are important and that the GDP is not a goal in itself, even though they might disagree. Tim Jackson says it's part of the problem. Ottmar Edenhofer says it's part of the solution. Nevertheless, they would actually both argue that politicians should focus less on growth and more on welfare or services. One of the things that I found especially interesting was the argument of Ottmar Edenhofer that maybe growth shouldn't be an issue in itself. We should just put it aside and develop different policies for the commons, for example. Tim Jackson, would you agree that the debate about growth is actually one that's not necessary to be debated?
Yeah, it's odd. I think Professor Edenhofer and I agree on everything.
Oh, no, you don't. No, we can
Except
just leave
the
for
conclusions
the
from the arguments, and interestingly, sometimes the same evidence we seem to come to different conclusions on. But is it okay to ditch the growth debate? I mean, this is a little paradoxical in a way, because one of my arguments is how looking through the lens of growth distorts our perspective on the way that investment works, the way that enterprise works, and the way that social organization works. So you would expect me to say, just ditch the GDP, get rid of it. There are two reasons, I think, where we can't. And one is that actually the conversation matters. It isn't, at this point, politically feasible to say, let's just forget about growth. At this point, let's open up the growth question. Whenever anyone mentions the G word, let's just interrogate what lies behind it. Let's have that conversation, because at the moment, extraordinary economic conversations are going on with no economic sense behind them whatsoever, because nobody's prepared to question
Then
the
tell
primacy.
me, what doesn't make sense from what we just heard from Ottmar Edenhofer? Where is he wrong? At what point do you disagree?
Okay, I mean, the second reason why I wouldn't want to throw away GDP is because it's not just a measure of welfare. In fact, it's not a measure of welfare. Economists have, and we are both agreed on that. It is a useful measure of production, of output in society. And the idea behind the national accounts is that the output of production constitutes the consumption goods of society, which constitutes the welfare of us as people. So it is actually still a useful measure to have around. But where I think Professor Edenhofer underestimates what I think is a crucial argument is around the feasibility of achieving these changes with economic growth and with the institutions of growth in place. And for the reasons that I tried to outline, I simply don't think that it's feasible to suppose you can get the degree of institutional change to support the investment that he and I would both like, while you have growth-oriented institutions that dominate financial sector markets. And so, and likewise, while the growth architecture is in place driving a social logic of consumerism, it's difficult to see how ordinary people can get off that bandwagon. How do you simply step aside from a society organized around an almost malevolent materialistic consumerism and create a society that works differently when every institution is focused on growth itself? So I think this is the primary distinction, I think, between Ottmar and myself, is that he sees more in technological possibilities that are achievable with the same economic institutions in place. My argument really is that if we want to be realistic about change, we have to shift a lot of those institutions and just won't get growth back, actually, as a result.
So actually, ditching the GDP and having this debate is more or less a wake-up call that we need, to cut you.
Yeah, I mean, ditch the GDP as a welfare measure. Keep it in place because it's a very good measure of busyness in the economy, and figure out what the implications of that means for people's jobs, for people's livelihoods, for the structure of our institutions, for your tax base, for your investment possibilities. You must keep an architecture of national accounting, but the idea that the GDP does more than that is wrong.
One of the arguments is that you are rather a technocrat while dealing with those issues.
Yeah, this is, it's just one blame.
Start with that one, we go to the others.
You have a few others. Yeah, no, I think from my point of view, the most important thing is probably I'm a little bit brainwashed, sitting together most of my time or emailing most of my time with people participating from different world regions in this climate change business, not necessarily in the climate change mitigation. And what I just mentioned today is in August we had a very interesting and a lively meeting in Washington with people from the African Development Bank. And it was quite obvious that if you say climate change or climate change mitigation is only possible without economic growth, so it is my experience then the conversation immediately stops. And the calculation I presented is one rationale behind this, because many people in the developing countries feel that the climate change discourse is another form of invention to push them back in a kind of a poverty trap. And what I would like to avoid is, and this is why I'm so happy that we have this discussion between Tim and myself. So you might call me a technocrat, and you might find a few other words which are not so nice. But
I would never.
But what you cannot say is that I am inherently a guy who is in favor of greedy behavior or immoral behavior. Sometimes I am, but most of the time I am not. So, which means that from my point of view, economic growth is not only about consumerism, it's not only about materialism, it's not only about relativism and what else. It's also a moral issue that we have to allow the people in the developing countries to escape from the poverty.
But then let's stick for a second, just for the sake of the argument, to the developed world. Let's keep Africa and India away, because one of the arguments is that those countries might need growth, but what about us?
Yeah, for us, I think it's absolutely legitimate to say, let's discuss about our lifestyle. Let's include more interesting components. For example, I'm absolutely in favor to say most of the expenditures in the healthcare system are investments even to increase or is an investment in people, which is fine. And I think phrasing the welfare state in a way that we invest in people, make people more capable to do things, this would be a total different framework from the framework we have now, where all the investments in the healthcare system, in the education system, are simply costs. And what you have pointed out, in my framework, this plays another role, what you told about the Bormal cost disease. From my point of view, this is a very, very fundamental challenge for the developed world in the next few decades. Because of this cost disease, we will see a remarkable increase of the costs in our healthcare sector. And we have to answer the question to what extent we are willing to pay for our elderly people, for long-term care, for our healthcare system and so on. Otherwise, if we kept expenditures, let's say to 10% of GDP, we are at risk that we will decline the quality of our healthcare system fundamentally and dramatically. I fully agree with that. We need a total different framework where we talk about health expenditures, education expenditures in a total different framework. But again, it's about over and it's about underinvestment. And this is, from my point of view, not the same language and not the same concept than to talk about growth or degrowth.
Well, if we did what you just suggested, what would be the result for growth then, if we really invested much more in services where the growth is slower than in production, if we invested in education?
You might be surprised. I'm agnostic about that. What I am saying is, let's take into account the externalities, let's address the technological risks, and let's come up with a reasonable definition what an investment is. And if an economy can grow, fine, then let's do this. So if we have so much externalities, but I am a little bit more optimistic, and it seems to me this is a fundamental difference between us. So I'm not a technocrat, but I'm
You're an optimist and he's a pessimist.
Let me conclude or finish. I am not a technocrat, but I'm much more optimistic what innovation can do. And in contrast to Schumpeter, I do not believe that innovation is in itself a blind force. I believe with appropriate policy instruments, we can give our innovations a proper direction. This is my metaphor with the steering wheel.
Tim, what about innovation? Can we have a solution with just the help of innovation?
With simply technological innovation, absolutely not. I mean, of course, technology does wonderful things, and of course, we have all, and myself actually very recently, benefited from technological innovation in the health sector. I wouldn't want to go back to the pain that I was in a few weeks ago, and I admit to that. And if that makes me a poor protagonist, I'm sorry about that. But the point actually, it's very interesting. There's a very interesting story I coming into, now I've started on my health, I might as well go on a little bit. I had 4 years ago an operation that went badly wrong, and I had to have it corrected 2 months ago. And what was very interesting to me was the experience of going through the health service in those years had got better, even though the GDP in the UK had fallen. So what I'm trying to point out is a degree of decoupling in a positive direction, that actually innovation in the things that matter is possible without that necessarily meaning innovation as a blind force, as you described it in terms of the GDP. I agree with you that innovation is not necessarily a blind force. I think it must not be a blind force. It must be something which is directed, in which innovation includes not just technical innovation, technological innovation, but also social innovation, in particular social innovation in the institutions that will lay down the investments on which future innovation depends. And I think, I mean, what you sketched in the last third of the talk, Ottmar, is genuinely a paradigmatic shift in the way that economics might work. And I have some disagreements with linear assumptions about the Hamiltonian, and I have some disagreements about the potential actually for risk-free commonality between those assets. But I believe what you're saying is genuinely important. It is, and I absolutely think your question is critical. Is there underinvestment or overinvestment in those different assets? And it's very, very clear that in some of those assets there is a chronic, massive, potentially catastrophic underinvestment. And that means you have to shift the investment patterns. And so what I want to do at that point is come back with a question and say, what do the institutions look like that would allow you to create that investment? Where do they exist at the moment? Do they exist in these financial markets that led us to the brink of disaster through the financial crash? Do they exist in the aftermath? Do they exist in the renegotiation of the Basel conditions? Do they exist in anything that President Obama has tried to do in the States in the financial sector? Do we have the institutions that would create, that would rectify this massive underinvestment? And if not, how do we create them?
Do you ask me now how to create these
With
institutions?
a question? Mm-hmm. In 2 minutes.
Okay, but so this is, if I would have an answer to this, I wouldn't have to wait for the climate lecture to reveal my secrets. Now, I think that's fundamentally right. And I think when we when we think about all these issues, governance and government institutions are really fundamental. And what I said is in one of my remarks, I believe that the 21st century is the century where we have to learn to cooperate. And we all know that economic theory and economists are quite pessimistic about the potential for cooperation because they believe there is always a strong incentives for free riders and so on. And I think we need, at the global scale, a minimum level of cooperation, otherwise we cannot resolve the climate problem. And even in Europe, we need a kind of a minimum cooperation, otherwise we cannot overcome the financial crisis. I think on this fundamental level, cooperation is very crucial. And the capitalism in the last century was basically a capitalism which relies on secured private property rights and competition. And I think we have to invent, to a certain extent, new forms of property rights, common property rights, and so on. And we have to find a way where people can learn in a much more sustainable way to cooperate. And I think this is, from my point of view, the most important social innovation we need. So, unfortunately, all this new behavioral economic stuff has helped us to understand a little bit more under what circumstances people are altruistic and so on. But from my point of view, the real challenge will be what Lynn Ostrom said several years ago. We need a kind of a better understanding of polycentric governance. So how at the different levels, what kind of institutions do we need? What can we solve at the global scale, at the national scale, at the regional scale, at the country scale, and how these different levels can interact with each other in a much more productive way. I think this is, from my point of view, an outline of a reasonable research program, and people who can solve this, I think they can go to Stockholm very soon.
Let's actually postpone that for the next lecture, I would suggest. But what would you then say would be the outcome if we had the investment that Tim just proposed, and that you actually agree as well, more investment in the environment, more investment in education? What's the outcome then for growth? Because growth is the essential topic of this lecture. Don't we have to care about that then?
I would say what I said is the accounting, I apologize for being technical, because the accounting for economic growth and to what extent societies wish economic growth, to what extent economic growth is desirable, depends on the arguments in the social welfare function. And it's absolutely right that we have a public debate. So what components should be seen as welfare increasing and what components should be perceived as welfare decreasing? And if we have such a public debate and we see such a kind of a social welfare function as including components which are a prerequisite that individuals can pursue their individual happiness. So I think that would be, from my point of view, a total appropriate way. If all these things are settled and we have the proper institutions, I wouldn't care about of the growth rate of GDP as such, because I'm caring about human well-being.
But would you actually agree that people like Tim Jackson, who with their argument that we don't need growth anymore, at least shake us up to then search maybe for the welfare function that you also think we should be looking for?
Tim said it's about the political conversation. And my feeling is, so in particular, people saying we need no longer growth or let's do degrowth, they are mixing means and ends.
Tim?
That's an unusual accusation to be receiving, since it's one that I normally make about people who argue that GDP is a good measure of well-being. There's a confusion of means and ends. I'm not quite sure where you stand. I'd quite like to clarify a little bit, because at some points in your argument you're saying we can do the climate change mitigation with economic growth. And at another point in your argument, you're saying that the GDP holds a positive relationship with the welfare functions. And
under very specific
circumstances. I mean, none of the circumstances, to be honest, that you had on your slides are remotely realistic. So the idea that you don't account for the degradation of capital in your welfare function, the fact, as you pointed out, that you don't have common pool resources of massive importance as yet in your welfare function, tells us at least that we have no idea whether there's a positive correlation between the GDP and a real meaningful welfare function.
I'm absolutely fine with that. But I think what you are saying basically is GDP, including the components of consumption and investment, is not sufficient. We need a broader understanding, and I fully agree with that. But then, if we take this, or we respect this perspective that we are talking about human well-being and we need a public debate about this, why shouldn't we then stop about growth? Let's talk about human well-being and how we would like to live in the next few decades, and what are our most important challenges. And then we are on the safe side, and we are speaking the same language. And if we have then the treasuries and the economic ministries using new accounting systems, I believe this would be fantastic if we would have this, because then what these people are doing, I'm not saying that we can be exactly right. I fully agree with that. This is just an approximation. And if you do not believe in my linear Hamiltonians, this is a pity. But I will convince you in another occasion on this. But if we have a different accounting system and people report on different accountings, I believe that we would have immediately a total different public discourse about our economic development.
Let me just clarify. My first training was in quantum physics, so I'm a great believer in non-linear Hamiltonians. I'm not a big believer in linear Hamiltonians. I'm sure that's
But what I'm saying
interest.
is, this is just a linear approximation to a non-linear relationship.
So I cut you off both now. Now, let's do a way quick check. We're at the university, so we can go 10-15 minutes longer than we are supposed to. We were supposed to stop now. I think we have 10 minutes more to go. You have the choice now. You can raise your arms either to you asking those two questions or to me continuing the debate with the two. Who wants the public to ask questions? Raise your hands.
Oh my God.
Oh, I do the counting words. Who wants the two to go on for another 10 minutes? It's the majority. Okay. Tim.
Probably not Pareto optimal.
It's a very gladiatorial audience we have here. I can't remember exactly where we were, to be honest, but I think I keep finding myself thinking, I agree with what this guy says, so how am I on the opposite side of the debate with him? And I think one of the things, just to clarify maybe this relationship between the GDP and the welfare function, if we could create a welfare function which said that communities matter, that work employment matters, that the common pool resources matter, that having a good health systems matter, and that this is our welfare function, why do we then need to mediate that through the assumption that you have to have a growing economy to get there? That would be my question, I think, to unravel the difference between us.
Again, so personally, I do not care about economic growth as such, but in developed countries. So you ignore the developing side of the coin, because this is a very serious issue, a very, very serious issue, and we should not say this. Anyway, I think so the time of the high growth rates in the developed countries anyway is over. I believe that we will have very low growth rates. But even if we have very low growth rates, we have not a transformation towards a more sustainable economy in the sense that we will reduce emissions even at a very low growth path. And what we have to do is, and the climate change issue is a quite pressing one, and we have not, we have basically 3 decades to do this. And I'm a little bit worried then to say we can only solve the climate change issue if we at the same time change all the institutions we have. So I try to find a way to say, okay, this is our starting point. Let's start with something what we can do in the next few decades. Let's start with that we decouple economic growth from emissions. And over this transformation process, we might anticipate or we might detect unintended consequences biomass, CCS, all these sorts of things, where we have to address this with different policy packages. So then this is the right way from my point of view to do this. And this is a kind of a laboratory which will enable us to find a new and a much more sustainable institutional setting. I agree with that. But I'm not saying growth must be the outcome. When we take into account and we try to address the risk and the externalities, I am totally happy. I acknowledge one of your arguments, saying, and this I understand your argument, you say, okay, it's fine. I am on your side when you ask for the internalization of externalities, and you say, fine. But your argument is, most of the politicians will not do this because they are so focused on one indicator like the GDP that they will never accept that the depletion of natural resources should be subtracted from the GDP.
And isn't that true?
This might be true, but this is a different argument, because then you have to say to the politicians, look, you have the wrong accounting system. You ignore important parts of human well-being. I'm then on your side. But if you say to the politicians, reduce your economic growth, but let all the other things at the same level, and you will not change this, I believe this will not help.
Tim, the argument is a very serious one that we are hearing over and over again. People tell us, just look what's happening in Greece, look what's happening in Spain, we have degrowth and nothing is getting better. And this is not the situation a country should be in at the same time, when it at the same time should reform its institutions, should its politics, should actually change the whole way the society works. I think the argument is a good one. What's your answer to that one? That you just
the argument that what we've seen in Greece, increasingly in Portugal and Spain, arguably even in the UK, is not a happy outcome, I think I would absolutely agree with. I mean, what we're looking at there is what happens to low-growth economies in a growth-based Europe. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at those who, for a number of reasons, some of their own responsibility, some of the responsibility of the way the Eurozone was created, the way the monetary Eurozone was created, some responsibility, some differences in cultural output even between Germany, who is in a strong position in the Eurozone, and Greece, which is in a weak position in the Eurozone. And these have created winners and losers in a race to the top, or in the worst cases, a race to the bottom. They've created deeply inequitable situations in which many of the policy prescriptions are making things worse rather than better, in which tranches of troika funding are released so that the next debt repayment can be made by the debtor countries, and in which none of that investment is really going where it is needed. Forget ecological investment. It's not going into health. It's not going into education. It's not going into community in those places. So it is a very poor example of what degrowth can achieve, and it's exactly in line with what I suggested was the experience from the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, in which the life expectancy of men in Russia plummeted over the space of a decade. And these are exactly why we have to take these, what I started with, the dilemma of growth, absolutely seriously. But they are not an example of the impossibility of different ways of organizing society. They're not an example of the impossibility of different financial institutions. They are a wake-up call to begin that process of renovating those institutions. And the good news for me, and it is good news, is that actually some of that experimentation that you call for, some of that working out of which financial institutions we need, is already happening. It's already happening at the small scale. It's already happening in some of those examples that I mentioned. It's happening in sustainable investments from pension funds that are looking to protect the long-term value of their funds rather than simply chasing after growth. But it's happening in the context, it's happening like salmon trying to swim upstream at the moment, with the governments pushing growth-based policies towards them at a rate of knots, with the Troika pushing growth-based policies at Greece and Portugal, with the UK cabinet sitting down and saying, believe it or not, the cabinet is now a growth cabinet. As we had a war cabinet during the Second World War, we now need a growth cabinet to redress the evils of this situation. And this is why the debate matters. It matters because while we cannot see beyond the existing institutions, we don't have a realistic hope of identifying solutions, even solutions that are already being tried and tested by small-scale institutions in real communities all over the world. I gain a lot of hope from those small-scale experiments, and to me, each one of them tells the same story, that there are different ways to organize the critical institutions, but at the moment they're being swamped by policy that sees growth as its principal driver.
Now you're making me almost desperate, because what you're actually arguing is that even within a Europe, one country can't do it alone. So we have to do the change together within Europe. And then you would probably argue, if you started in Europe, we can't do it without Asia, and then we can't do it without the US. So who can start where?
Everybody can start everywhere, actually. I mean, these small experimental things just happen. Fantastic examples of social investment from Venezuela in, for example, the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra, which takes kids from the favelas, gives them a cultural ambition, sets them on a journey through life that gives them opportunities they would never had. A community bank in the USA, which sets it up and says, we're tired of financial institutions that draws money from people who can't afford to pay it back in order to invest in things that degrade the environment. We want to set up a community fund, as the example I showed, for a real community on the ground. Examples of enterprises who say, yes, these property regimes are broken. Let's come up with a different property regime. Let's have a different ownership structure. Let's think again about mutuality. Let's look at cooperative and social enterprise. Let's build actually institutions from the ground up. So they're not places, I think, to despair. They're places to recognize that when difficult situations arise, social experimentation is natural. It's already happening. And the appropriate way to take that forward is to nurture it, is to produce the conditions under which it can flourish.
But what's your argument? What's your answer to that, what we just heard? Is this basically cued, or could that be the beginning and the start of a different welfare function that you're hoping for?
I have to say, and to be honest, I am not a great believer in the small is beautiful story. Because I think the scale of our challenges, historical challenges, is unprecedented. And we are really running out of time to invent and to establish institutions which help us to solve the problem. And to tell the people, think locally, act locally, think globally, it's from my point of view a nice phrase, but I am a little bit skeptical. So I believe that the time is coming where we have to think about our nation states and how to rebuild to a certain extent our nation states. And here I would like to come up with, so Tim said that it's about conversation, it's about language. And my feeling is that this understanding or this concept of the wealth of nations is, from my point of view, a quite compelling one. Because you mentioned several times the financial crisis. It is worthwhile to ask ourselves, what happened during the financial crisis? What components of our wealth has been destroyed? And how is wealth really distributed across our globe? Do we have really a proper understanding about the increasing inequality of the wealth of nations? I do not believe that. I think it is a high time to think about this issue. What are the most important sources of wealth creation, and what are the most important sources of wealth destruction? And at the same time, who has to bear the burden, who has to bear the costs, and how has the wealth of nations, or our wealth, be transformed and changed, and the wealth distribution over the last 3 decades? I think that's a very fundamental question. And I'm a little bit worried when we talk about degrowth. This has the flavor, this is from my point of view not compelling, this has the flavor of poverty traps. It has the flavor that people cannot flourish. But from my point of view, it's very important that we should ask our governments, do we really take into account the most important components of wealth creation? Just one example and then I finish. So think about the years 2008 and 2006 when we had across Europe and in particular in the United States a housing bubble. Was the housing bubble really wealth creation or not? So I believe this was not wealth creation at all. But it is not easy to understand why when a stock explodes, the value of stock explodes, why this is not wealth creation. And we should think about this and we should explain the public under what conditions really creation of wealth happens. And I think this is a quite compelling story. And at the same time, we should think about the distribution of wealth, and this is also quite important. And I'm saying that what I'm arguing is this is nothing new compared to what Adam Smith tried to achieve in his time. So and in that sense, I think we should not reinvent the wheel. We have to do the same things in our time.
A good conversation is like a good dinner. You should stop when it's really, when it smells good, when it tastes good, when you think, I want to have more of it. I would love to have more of those two people, but time is running out. Tim, I know you have the final word. You are our guest. You get the final word. Now, your final 2 minutes. Tell me, are you rather more optimistic now than you've been at the beginning of this conversation, or would you say, oh my God, it's...
Of this conversation, I am optimistic, and I'm massively more optimistic than I was that Friday night that I described to you when I had the phone
so
call.
Downing Street have been calling you again?
They haven't called back recently. It's odd that. I would like to end my 2 minutes really by saying just a couple of very small things. One is that that I'm absolutely not suggesting that we hand this over to small is beautiful local solutions, and that is not the way that I work. Actually, my work is in some cases able to explore what happens in those exploratory places and to find the lessons from it. But it is also equally to work with those mainstream institutions, to work with institutional investors, to work with sustainable and responsible investment funds, to work with capital that is trying to create change in a positive way. And so it is absolutely not a simplistic call for a return to simple local solutions. And I agree absolutely with Otmar about the challenges. I also agree with him, I'll say this again, about almost everything. It's kind of a puzzle still that we end up at different conclusions. And it's probably partly through training, and it's probably partly through real dilemmas that still persist. How do we organize those institutions? How do we create genuinely useful social welfare functions? How do we understand the determinants of those? And how do we make our economies work? And as I said before, to me, that's not at all dispiriting. It's hugely exciting as both an intellectual project and a social project, and it could not be more timely, because I think both of us agree that the kind of growth-based economics that we've seen in neoliberal economies in the West has a matter of decades at most to last. But I would really finish perhaps just by thanking Otmar for being such a robust combatant, and to Peak and Teu for hosting us this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and to you, Petra, for your moderation.
And I thank the audience. I thank those two.